So today we're going to talk about the story of Lauren Heike, somebody who lived out in Arizona, 29 years old, beautiful young woman who went for a hike and unfortunately was murdered by a man called Zion Teasley. And we're going to have to talk about why we cover stories like this, because anytime you have somebody like me who's selecting individual local crime stories and elevating them, there should be a purpose behind it. And unsurprising to many of you out there in the audience, the reason we're talking about this is because I have just discovered that there were broader policy failures that led to Zion being released in the first place. And once again, we have another instance of soft on crime leading to the death of an innocent. But before we get into that, I just want to thank everybody who signed up over on actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Thank you for your support, and I want to thank everybody who has signed up for the podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
Hey, Celeste, Teasley just had his initial appearance in court this morning. He's being held on a $1 million cash bond, accused of first-degree murder in the death of Lauren Heike, and we're learning new details about cell phone and DNA evidence linked to the 22-year-old suspect. It's been a large effort from Phoenix PD to find Heike's killer. Police discovered the body of the 29-year-old woman on a hiking trail in Phoenix last Saturday morning. A friend of Heike told police she planned to hike with another friend the day prior. Police spoke with that friend, and he said he could not get in contact with Heike that day.
So as told to you by the local news reporter, Lauren Heike was supposed to go on a hike with another friend on the day in question, where she ultimately ended up getting killed. Now, she could not be reached by this friend. This caused people to have some kind of an alarm, and later on we end up finding the body of Heike on or near or somewhere about the hiking trail. And unfortunately, what we ended up discovering was not only was this a murder, but it was a particularly gruesome homicide.
According to probable cause statements, investigators believe Heike was chased through or over a barbed wire fence based on her belongings and the condition of her clothing. An autopsy revealed Heike was stabbed 15 times. Wounds on her hands and arms showed signs of defense.
So it's a brutal crime. During the course of time that she was trying to escape, at some point she had to crawl over a barbed wire fence. She had defensive wounds, 15 wounds overall. We're going to get into the motivation a little bit later, but I do want to point out that even though Zion is not convicted at this moment, and it's all alleged, there's pretty good evidence for us to believe that he happens to be the perpetrator of this crime.
Police investigated hours of surveillance video in the area and spotted a suspect running after Heike and then sprinting away before returning to the location where her body was found before the suspect climbed over barbed wire. It's confirmed that Zion Teasley is the man seen on surveillance footage by his probation officer. Police say his cell phone pinged traveling westbound on Princess Drive that morning, consistent with the time of the video. Investigators recovered DNA from Heike's shoe, tested it, and yesterday a profile came back matching to Teasley. Records show Teasley lives a mile and a half away from where the murder happened, and witnesses interviewed by police say he routinely carried a 3-inch pocket knife.
So as you heard right there, this guy lives in the area. He is identified by his own probation officer on the surveillance video as the person running in the direction of Heike, then running back, then doubling back to where the body was found. You also have reports from eyewitnesses that he's in and around this area a lot because he lives around there, and he carries a 3-inch pocket knife, which is believed to be the murder weapon. Then you have the DNA test that ties him to the scene, and there's also cell phone evidence. Again, it is still alleged at this point because he's not convicted, but you understand why people have a strong suspicion that this is definitely the guy. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this person's motivation. I just want to get into that really quickly because although you might find it interesting, to me, it's something to go over quickly because in reality, in actuality, the policy implications of why this guy was out on the street in the first place are far more interesting to me. So, there has been a lot of reports of him identifying on a LinkedIn profile. Don't know how any 22-year-old is still using LinkedIn as a non-binary, according to certain statements that this person may have issued to the police at any given time. This person potentially was motivated by a desire to look like this woman. So we have somebody who potentially had this weird attraction / anger associated or affiliated with that attraction and wanted to be an attractive 29-year-old white woman instead of being a black male. So very strange in terms of the motivation. I know that's what a lot of people are paying attention to. A lot of people are harping on. You can be interested in that all you want. I will link sources in the description that goes over that. However, what is far more interesting to me is that once again in Arizona, just like we've seen in state after state across this country in recent years, we have an example of somebody who was released early despite overwhelming evidence that he was a violent criminal who was going to do something like this again.
Investigators recovered DNA from Heike's shoe, tested it, and yesterday a profile came back matching to Teasley.
Even though it is not stated outright in this news report, I think your ears should have been perking up when they said that his DNA was matched to him based on the profile that they discovered at the scene. Obviously, if the police are matching his DNA, they have to have a sample of it already in order to compare it to something, which means that this person was arrested and likely convicted right off the bat of a felony. On top of that, he was identified by his probation officer. You are on probation when you commit a crime. Now you might be thinking to yourself, it's probably not a serious crime. They wouldn't have released somebody who showed this exact ideation prior to this. This is definitely not an instance where the good folks in Arizona completely dropped the ball. And of course, you would be completely wrong because Zion's criminal record is exactly what you would expect for a perpetrator to commit a crime like this. It is almost perfectly aligned with what you would expect to see in the lead up to this kind of murder, and it's one of the reasons why incarceration for the purposes of incapacitation is so valuable as a criminal justice tool in order to not just lower the crime statistics, but to save actual people's lives. So according to the Scottsdale Progress, which is listed as your hometown newspaper, Zion was a convicted felon who was released early based on a program and eventually arrested for the murder, which is of course what we found out. However, when you look at his criminal history, I just want you to think in your brain, is this the person that you think should have been eligible for an early release? Now, his charges that stemmed from his 2020 arrest were lengthy, including armed robbery with a deadly weapon, this would be a firearm, kidnapping, and aggravated assault after a string of convenience store robberies. So in 2020, the year of the greatest civil rights protests in the history of our country, the Black Lives Matter riots, this guy is committing multiple different robberies at convenience stores with firearms present in some of them. He's also getting kidnapping charges because he's moving people around during the course of the robberies. Now, according to the pre-sentence report, he was 18 at the time of the robberies, and he told a probation officer that he had been drinking heavily due to depression. Aw, what a poor baby. He said he was unemployed, so basically he was just an Aladdin, and he lived with his mother, which is where he planned to return after his release from incarceration. Now, some of you might not be sensitive to the plight of this poor Aladdin, the emotional distress that this man is dealing with, so I also want to add, on top of everything else, that he was not only just an Aladdin, he was also an aspiring scholar. He actually told his probation officer that he was attending Paradise Valley Community College and planned to get degrees in engineering and art.
There's other circumstantial evidence, for example, him living in the area, statements that were made by people who know him and worked with him about, for example, a knife that would have been consistent with the murder weapon. So given the strength of the evidence, given the nature and circumstances of the offense, given the prior serious offense, and the court did mention that there's a probation hold, I think the court is aware there were 3 convictions there: a robbery, armed robbery, which is a prior serious offense, and a disorderly conduct. I believe he was released from prison in November, so he hasn't been out that long.
So you can understand why the probation officer and the parole officer were very much in support of this young man with so much potential. I mean, he said that he wanted to be an engineer and an artist, so obviously scholarly aspirations. So how do you weigh that against his propensity to threaten deadly force time and time again in order to obtain what he wants in this moment? Obviously, if you're a probation officer or a parole officer, you gotta look at this and just take a chance that this kid is going to turn out to be the engineer of the future. Maybe this guy could have designed a rocket that didn't blow up over Houston, Texas. Elon Musk could have hired him, but it turns out maybe the indicators were a little less clear for the scholarly future for this young man than one would have believed, because what we ended up finding out by going through the complaint is that this person robbed the same 2 stores over 6 times. As I said, the report says that he robbed 2 Circle K stores a total of 6 times in May, June, and July of 2020. He had a gun on several occasions, usually demanding the clerks put the money on Google Pay cards. He was arrested July 4th of 2020. As a part of the plea deal, he actually admitted to armed robbery, disorderly conduct with a weapon, and robbery, and a dozen other charges were dismissed. Now, because of this sweetheart plea deal, and it was only his first 6 offenses that the police department knew about, he ended up getting a 3-year sentence, and he served about 75% of that. Now, that is actually typical, or more than typical, in cases like this. You also have to factor in that he had a year in jail awaiting trial, so this would have been down to the plea bargain itself, rather than the truth in sentencing, which doesn't really exist anywhere in this country. However, I do think it is notable that had he actually been obligated to serve 100% of his sentence and not been released early, according to this program, he would still be in jail up until July of this year. So yes, it is true that had he served 100% of that sentence, he just would not have been available to murder this poor woman. But more importantly, more crucially, the issue that I have with the way that this case was prosecuted is that you have evidence of a person repeatedly threatening deadly force in order to get what he wants in the moment. He is not afraid to terrify people, threaten them with a weapon. He has that kidnapping charge for a reason, because he's ordering people to go where he wants, and all of those additional charges that could have carried more sentence were dropped in favor of negotiating this deal because they bought into his sob story. They were like, oh, well, he had an alcohol problem because he was depressed, and aren't we so sad? And honestly, if we just give this young man a chance, if we just let him go out into the world, he's definitely going to become an engineer/artist, and then we're all going to be happier and joyful along the way. When in reality, in actuality, when somebody shows you who they are time and time again, you need to have some way of incapacitating these people, because what we find out is they end up graduating to further, more dangerous acts. The fact that depression, a mental issue, was used as a way to mitigate the issues that this guy was dealing with makes no sense at all to me, because if you have mental issues that are supposedly leading you to commit more crimes, the chances of those just being cured if you're released after a short sentence just does not make any sense. What is more likely to happen is that these kind of things will get aggravated, is that this young man who thinks that violence is an appropriate way, coupled with substance abuse, in order to deal with whatever mental issues, will only escalate their behavior, and that is exactly what happened right here. So while there are a lot of different varying ways to attack this story, a lot of angles that you could take, you could highlight the racial angle, you could talk about how, but for this being a black on white crime, this would be international news, and that's all fine and dandy, but in reality, the actual issue, the thing that makes this case stick out, and it's becoming more and more common amongst many of the other cases that we're covering, is the fact that this person could have easily been held by a tough on crime criminal justice system, and thus Lauren Heike would still be alive today. And this really goes to the ideology that is undergirding all of the reform efforts, the idea that our prison system, that our criminal justice system is meant to be a sort of penal welfare system for the perpetrators of crime, rather than a system that makes sure that there are less victims and that we get justice for the victims that we already have. We all understand that a certain amount of crime is going to happen. It is a consequence of living as a human being, living in a free society. We all get that to a certain extent. But instead of being so focused on giving 7th chances to career criminals like this person, maybe we should think about how this girl did not have a chance alone hiking in a mountain when a man that was twice her size attacked her with a weapon. Maybe we should think about the woman who had to crawl over barbed wire in a desperate attempt to flee, rather than the aspirations and the engineering and artistry of a criminal who showed us 6 different times he has a willful disregard for human life, that he's willing to threaten people, willing to hurt people in order to achieve an instant gratification of Google Pay cards. By the way, if you're wondering how he got caught, really not that hard to figure it out. The guy robbed the same 2 stores a total of 6 times, and then he got gift cards, which are very traceable. This is not rocket science that this guy was not somebody who was smart enough to get away with this crime, and we should not be granting grace to criminals just because they show us a complete and utter stupidity while committing their initial crimes. Look, we can't control for every repeat offender. I'm not going to pretend that nobody is going to slip through the cracks at any point in time, but the fact of the matter is, this guy had obvious signs, and sometimes getting the fastest plea deal in order to sort out the case as quickly as possible and putting a win on the board at the district attorney's office is not an adequate solution. Sometimes these pre-trial assessments that parole officers do are not that well thought out, they're not that cared for, and they have a bunch of ridiculous nonsense in it, like some unemployed guy who has no aspirations for education who's committing robberies is on the cusp of being an engineer. He's not an engineer, and somebody's dead, and there should be some accountability for it. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about yet another instance of soft on crime biting back and costing somebody their life. Till next time.